There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been underestimating themselves. For one woman, that moment came when someone's hand connected with her face in front of 300 people. What started as what should have been the happiest day of her life turned into something far more significant. It became a story about wealth, power, and what happens when someone finally decides they won't be broken anymore. The beginning of any good story isn't always where you think it is. We need to go back 3 years to understand how we got to that church on that particular Saturday morning. Sarah and Marcus had been together since their mid-20s. They met in an ordinary way at a friend's dinner party. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment, just two people who made each other genuinely happy. Marcus came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so long they forgot there was ever a time when they weren't. His mother, Elizabeth, had married into that fortune 40 years earlier, and she'd spent every single day since proving she belonged there. Sarah came from a small town in the Midwest. Her parents were good people. They worked hard. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough for them. From the moment Elizabeth heard about Sarah, she began constructing a narrative. In her mind, this woman was a threat, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, someone who hadn't been groomed since birth for the role of blackthorn wife. Elizabeth had rules, unwritten but rigid. The women who married into her family had to meet specific criteria: elite education, the right ancestry, the right accent, the right everything. Sarah had none of those things, and Elizabeth made sure she knew it. The comments started small, little digs that seemed innocent on the surface, observations about Sarah's background, questions about her family's connections, remarks about how charming her accent sounded. What Elizabeth meant was, "You don't belong here." But here's something about people who grow up with nothing. They develop a certain kind of resilience. They learn to smile through things that would break other people. They know how to survive. The engagement came after a year of dating. Marcus proposed on a beach at sunset. It was simple and perfect, and it made Sarah happier than she'd ever been. Elizabeth's response was to immediately begin planning the wedding, not with Sarah, but around her. She had a vision for how this event should look, a vision that had nothing to do with what Sarah wanted. She hired a designer to create an elaborate dress without consulting Sarah. She booked a string quartet, negotiated catering at 5-star French restaurants, arranged for the ceremony to be held in the most prestigious church in the area. Everything was designed to showcase the Blackthorn name and legacy. Sarah wasn't a bride, she was a prop in Elizabeth's production. The rehearsal dinner was where things began to shift into something darker. Sarah overheard conversations that made her stomach turn. Elizabeth was telling her friends about a plan. She called it a test, to determine once and for all whether Sarah was genuinely in love with Marcus or whether, as Elizabeth suspected, she was after the money. The logic was simple and utterly cruel. Create chaos, create conflict, see how Sarah responded, see what she was really made of. Elizabeth believed that stress would reveal character. In her mind, she was being protective. She was being a good mother. What she was actually doing was planning to humiliate a woman in front of 300 people. The sabotage started days before the wedding. Small things, a destroyed dress, the wrong flowers, mistakes with Sarah's hair that no stylist would have made on accident. But here's what Elizabeth didn't count on. Sarah noticed. And when Sarah noticed, something inside her changed. She wasn't angry exactly. She was clear, focused. She understood what was happening, and she understood that she had a choice. She could be a victim, or she could play a different game. She chose the game.
The night before the wedding, Sarah and her best friend Jenny made a decision. It was crazy, it was risky, but it was also the only move that made sense. The wedding coordinator had just called with a family emergency. She was leaving. The position was suddenly vacant. Sarah looked at her friend and said something she'd never said before. "I need you to trust me." Jenny didn't hesitate. Sarah showed up that morning in her grandmother's dress from the 1960s. It was beautiful, but nothing like what everyone expected. Her hair, damaged from the sabotage, was hidden under a veil. Emergency makeup covered the stress hives that had erupted on her skin. She looked completely different from the woman everyone had been preparing to mock, and Elizabeth had never actually met her in person. In a church hallway, Sarah borrowed a clipboard and a name tag. She pulled her hair back. She changed her posture. She became someone else entirely. She walked toward Elizabeth like an employee toward her boss. Elizabeth looked right through her. That's when Sarah heard it. The things Elizabeth was saying about her, the racist comments, the assumptions about her motivation, the certainty that she was a gold digger looking for a green card and access to family money. Sarah's hands gripped that clipboard so hard it nearly snapped, but her voice stayed steady, professional, calm. She asked questions, open-ended ones, questions designed to let Elizabeth reveal herself completely. Elizabeth took the bait without hesitation. She talked about manufactured evidence, about fake accusations of theft that she and her daughter Cassandra had planned to present during the ceremony. She talked about how her son would come crawling back to her once he understood what Sarah supposedly was. She talked about a laminated list, requirements for any woman who married into the family, Ivy League education, Mayflower ancestry, knowledge of obscure dining etiquette. It was absurd and absolutely real. Elizabeth actually showed this list to her friends. They gasped with delight. They offered suggestions for how to humiliate Sarah more effectively. As the ceremony approached, Elizabeth grew increasingly desperate. The bride hadn't appeared yet. She'd spent the last hour interrogating a blonde woman in an expensive suit, convinced it was Sarah. It wasn't. Sarah was in a closet with Tom, Marcus's best man. Well, Sarah was interrupting what was happening in the closet. Cassandra was there, hands in places they absolutely should not have been. This was part of Elizabeth's plan, apparently, to manufacture drama, to create chaos. Tom's face turned white. Sarah delivered a simple message from the closet. "Your mother is looking for you, Cassandra. Something about the plan." Cassandra smiled with malicious excitement. She explained the fake evidence she'd planted. She described the moment she and her mother would expose Sarah's alleged theft at the altar. Tom's horror was immediate and genuine. He backed away from Cassandra like she was something dangerous, because she was. The moment approached. The bridesmaids had walked. The guests were settled. The organist was ready. Everyone was waiting for the bride. Elizabeth stood up. She turned around. She looked toward the back of the church with visible rage, and she saw someone she didn't recognize walking down the aisle. At least, she thought it was someone she didn't recognize. In that moment, something inside Elizabeth snapped. All the control she'd carefully maintained broke. She looked at this woman, this stranger as far as Elizabeth knew, and saw the wedding timeline slipping away, saw her narrative collapsing, saw her plan failing in real time. She stood up. She approached the woman, and she struck her across the face with enough force that the sound echoed through a silent church. The woman she hit was Sarah. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the organist had stopped playing mid-note. And then Marcus's voice cut through the air. His microphone, the one attached to his lapel for the wedding video, was on, and it was broadcasting to the church's sound system. Every word Elizabeth had said to the coordinator came through those speakers. Every racist comment, every cruel assumption, every revelation of her plan. 300 people had just listened to Elizabeth confess to sabotage and assault.
Marcus walked down from the altar with slow, deliberate steps. "Mother," he said, "I'd like you to meet someone." He reached for Sarah's hand. She took it.
Sarah pulled off the veil. She let her hair fall free. Marcus pulled her close to him, and the resemblance became obvious. The woman Elizabeth had slapped was her daughter-in-law. The woman she'd been sabotaging all morning was standing right beside the groom. Elizabeth's face went from purple rage to ghostly white in seconds. Her mouth opened and closed like she was drowning in air. Cassandra looked like someone had physically struck her, which, in a way, they had. But Marcus wasn't finished. He told his mother about Cassandra's attempt to seduce Tom in the coat closet. He referenced Tom's conversation with his sister, where she'd bragged about planting false evidence. He pulled out the receipts, the ones showing Elizabeth's credit card payments for the destroyed flowers, the wine that had ruined Sarah's dress, the hairstylist she'd paid to make deliberate mistakes. Elizabeth's signature was on every single transaction. Richard, Marcus's father, stood up. He'd been quiet throughout all of this, but his expression said what his silence had been hiding. He'd known about Elizabeth's cruelty for years. He'd let it happen. He'd been too afraid of confrontation to stop it. And now his son was suffering the consequences of that cowardice. Richard looked at his wife of 40 years, and he didn't see the woman he'd married. He saw someone he no longer recognized. Richard's words were simple and final. The divorce papers will be filed Monday. Elizabeth tried to protest, tried to minimize, tried to reframe what had just happened. But the church had become a courtroom, and everyone in it had witnessed the evidence. Marcus looked at his mother and said something that would haunt her for years. He said, "A mother loves her children. A mother wants them to be happy. A mother doesn't destroy the best thing that ever happened to them because of her own prejudices. You're not my mother," he said. "You're just the woman who gave birth to me." And then Elizabeth was escorted out of the church while 200 people began to clap. What happened next was something no one expected. When Sarah's name was called at the altar, she walked down the aisle wearing a simple white sundress. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress, just something clean and hers. The ceremony was brief and genuine. No pretentious vows that Elizabeth had tried to write. No elaborate unity candle ceremony. Just two people promising to love and protect each other from complications they never should have had to face. When the Reverend pronounced them married, the church erupted in genuine joy, not the strained performance of society people pretending to care. Real joy, real celebration. The reception that followed would have horrified Elizabeth in every possible way. The DJ played actual music. The food was comfort food from Sarah's favorite local restaurant. People laughed genuinely. They danced without self-consciousness. The speeches were something else entirely. Tom talked about watching Marcus suffocate under his mother's expectations for 15 years. He talked about how Sarah didn't just marry him, she saved him. Jenny talked about grace and strength, about knowing when to stand firm and when to move. She talked about how Sarah had taught everyone present what it looked like to survive with dignity. But the showstopper came from Marcus's grandmother. She wheeled herself to the microphone and began telling stories about Elizabeth, 40 years of stories. She talked about how Elizabeth had married Richard for money, not love. How she'd spent decades systematically isolating him from everyone who actually cared about him. How she'd built a prison of propriety and locked him inside. Then she looked directly at Sarah. She said, "Some families are born into, and some families are chosen, and the chosen ones are often stronger." The room erupted in tears and applause. By the time the reception ended, something remarkable had happened. The wedding videographer had recorded everything: the confrontation, the assault, the reveal, the broadcast through the church speakers, all of it. A guest had live-streamed it to social media. By the time the couple cut their grocery store sheet cake at midnight, the video had 2 million views. The comments were almost uniformly in support of Sarah, against Elizabeth, celebrations of a woman who'd chosen to fight back in the most elegant way possible. The fallout came quickly. Richard moved forward with the divorce immediately. His lawyers had documentation of Elizabeth's financial manipulation over decades. The evidence was substantial and damaging. Elizabeth's society friends disappeared within days, not slowly, immediately, as if she'd become a pariah. Her daughter, Cassandra, moved to California with vague references to finding herself. What she actually meant was, "I need to escape the shame." What Elizabeth hadn't counted on was the duration of consequence. 6 months later, she was living in a studio apartment, working as a receptionist at a dental office. The woman who'd called everyone else the help was now doing the helping. She'd lost the money, the status, the position. She'd lost her children. She'd lost her social circle. For the first time in 40 years, Elizabeth was alone. She called Marcus one evening. Not Sarah, Marcus. Her voice was different, broken down, human in a way it hadn't been before. "I need help," she said. Marcus put the phone on speaker so Sarah could hear. Elizabeth's explanation was simple. She'd been wrong about everything, about Sarah, about what mattered, about what family actually meant. She'd spent 40 years trying to control everyone around her, and she'd ended up alone. She asked, carefully, if Marcus would ever consider letting her meet her grandchild. Supervised visits, no expectations, just the possibility of knowing her family. Sarah made a decision that surprised most people who heard about it. She said yes, but not immediately, not without conditions. Victoria needed to go to real therapy. She needed to work through the racism, the classism, the narcissism, the entitlement that had driven every decision she'd made. After a year, they would have coffee, just coffee, and they would see. "That's more than I deserve," Elizabeth whispered. "Yes," Marcus said. "Don't waste it." A year passed. Elizabeth kept her word. She showed up in regular clothes, not the designer armor she'd hidden behind for decades. She asked questions about Sarah's family, Sarah's culture, Sarah's dreams, and she actually listened to the answers. When their daughter was born, Elizabeth was allowed supervised visits, 1 hour at a time, baby steps. The last event in this story was Richard's wedding to Susan, a woman who ran a food truck and made Richard genuinely happy for the first time in decades. Elizabeth attended as a regular guest, nothing more. She sat in the back. She wore blue. She didn't try to control anything or make it about her progress. During the reception, she approached Sarah. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Sarah asked. "For being strong enough to break the cycle. For showing Marcus he deserved better. For giving me a chance to change." Then she walked away. No drama, no demands, just acknowledgement. Later that night, Marcus and Sarah danced with their daughter balanced on his hip. He said something that captured the entire meaning of what had happened. "Our daughter will never know that version of her grandmother. She'll only know whoever Elizabeth becomes from this moment forward." Here's what's interesting about this story. It didn't end with a villain getting destroyed and disappearing forever. It ended with a villain getting destroyed and actually changing. Elizabeth didn't get forgiven easily. She didn't get to return immediately. She had to work for it. She had to prove through years of changed behavior that she was genuine. And even then, the relationship remained careful, bounded, supervised, because some wounds take time to heal, and some trust take years to rebuild. What Sarah did at that wedding wasn't just about defending herself. It was about forcing everyone to see the truth they'd been ignoring. It was about making consequences visible and unavoidable. The slap was the moment everything changed.
But it wasn't the slap itself that mattered. It was what came after. The truth, the witnesses, the recording, the exposure. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the best versions of ourselves. Sometimes what looks like a disaster is actually an opportunity for transformation. The question isn't whether we'll face people like Elizabeth in our lives. Most of us will. The question is whether we'll have the clarity to see it happening, the courage to respond, and the strength to survive what comes next. Sarah did all three. And in doing that, she changed not just her life, but everyone around her.